Vampire Survivors was one of those games that just sort of came out of nowhere and took Steam by storm for a while. You know, it's one of those small, unassuming releases that just sort of appears one day on the store all of a sudden and remains a top seller for like over a month. But the cool thing about Vampire Survivors specifically was that it was effectively the birth of an entirely new genre, something that started to become popular just after its release. And we don't really get to see the genesis of a genre all that often, at least not in real time like this, so I thought it would be cool to make a sort of a multi-part video series just about this genre in general, because like I said, it's rare that we actually get to watch the whole thing blossom like from the start. It's usually over a longer period of time that stuff like this happens. And I wanted to just look at the game itself as well as the other games that have come afterwards that have been inspired by it. But first off, for the very first video, I think it would be best to actually take a look at not just Vampire Survivors itself, but also the genre as a whole and where it actually came from, because this is actually a pretty interesting case of a genre moving platforms multiple times before finally coming to the form it currently is in today. But of course, before all that, there's also the matter of what to call this genre, and I've heard lots and lots and lots of different suggestions, like, horde survival, although that for me that tends to bring to mind stuff like Left 4 Dead and Killing Floor, but you kind of get why people would go for that. I've even heard garlic-like proposed, which is sort of funny, but the one I've heard probably the most often, and the one that I personally like myself, is bullet heaven, and that's because these games are effectively meant to be reverse bullet hells, because in a bullet hell you are a tiny little thing trying to survive against an overwhelming onslaught of 8 quadrillion projectiles on screen, where one hit equals a death. But the whole point of one of these games is to be the bullet hell. You are the bullet hell yourself. You are the one spewing the countless projectiles, and everything else around you is dying super fast. So these are games where you are meant to sort of compress the sort of roguelite, make yourself stronger, and have synergizing passives experience, all within like a 30-minute time frame. But to fully understand where the genre actually comes from, you've got to go back to the earlier days of the creation of what we call the roguelite. So we're talking about games like The Binding of Isaac, games like Enter the Gungeon, games that are about starting as a very weak character with a very basic attack, and then getting new weapons and items and passives and things along your journey, slowly stacking them into what is hopefully going to be a very synergistic, very powerful combination to become as overpowered as possible as quickly as you can to survive the later levels. This is a very addicting formula for many people, myself included. I really enjoy these games. I know that there is a bit of an oversaturation of them for a lot of people, but I personally do quite like them, and I find the nature of like compressing an RPG like leveling experience down to like an hour-long run of just trying to become overpowered, I find that really satisfying and just very enjoyable. Somewhere deep in my lizard brain, it really just sort of speaks to me. But a sort of snapshot of the earlier state of this genre around the time of the popularity of Isaac Rebirth and Enter the Gungeon and things, this, like I said, a snapshot of this genre was taken across platforms over to mobile gaming. And we got games like, for instance, Soul Knight, as well as Otherworld Legends, both of them by the same developer called Chili Room, and we've also got some more recent examples too, games like Raspberry Mash, for instance. And these were pretty successful mobile interpretations of the PC roguelite genre. They used the sort of Isaac-like rules of starting with a very basic weapon and then over time growing to get more powerful weapons, as well as a bunch of synergizing passives to make yourself stronger. It was a very familiar concept, and it worked pretty well on mobile. However, the thing about mobile gaming is it's all done pretty much exclusively on a touchscreen. So whenever you have a game that is relatively demanding controls-wise, has things like a virtual joystick and things like several virtual buttons at once, this means that they can be kind of difficult to play on mobile platforms, because it's not the most fun thing ever to try and mash all those controls on a screen with absolutely no tactile feedback. So even though these games were pretty successful for their time, there also was a lot of room to iterate this genre to be more simplistic, because that's sort of the way that mobile gaming goes, right? The most popular games are the ones with the most simplistic possible controls boiled down to be very touchscreen friendly. This, unfortunately, is often the enemy of complex game design, and is what causes a lot of the stigma around mobile games being overly simplistic. However, that doesn't change the fact that there's always room for any genre that has made its way to mobile to be simplified to be even more mobile-friendly than usual, and that is where Archero comes in. You see, Archero was an evolution of the same concept, the sort of roguelite run-by-run, make yourself stronger and hopefully overpowered kind of thing, condensed even further to fit better on a mobile phone, because now you only had one control, your thumb to move, that's it. Your character simply auto-fires whenever you stop moving, so the game was about strategizing when to move. Effectively, it was all about just using your thumb to move, stop moving to shoot, start moving in to dodge projectiles, and so on, and it used the same sort of formula where you start with a very simple weapon, and then you get multiple different passives that stack together to make yourself more powerful over time, room by room. But, of course, another important thing to understand about mobile gaming is that something that is relatively unique does not remain unique for long. Once something has been proven to be successful, you will see roughly 150,000 clones of it by the weekend, and that's exactly what happened with Archero. Even to this day, Archero clones are some of the most commonly made mobile games out there. But some people weren't fully satisfied with the Archero concept as it was being iterated by everyone trying their hand at it, and instead some people decided to actually try and take it a little farther back towards what it used to be while still maintaining the simplistic controls of Archero, and that is where we get a specific game known as Magic Survival. And Magic Survival was all about being on one very large screen and slaying massive hordes of enemies with increasingly powerful spells and upgrades. It's a very familiar formula if you've ever played Vampire Survivors, and that's because, after a while, someone was inspired by Magic Survival and wanted to bring this newly innovated form of this old genre back onto PC, so it crossed over again back to PC and became Vampire Survivors. The developer himself has actually stated that he was directly inspired by Magic Survival to create this game. So that's sort of the story of the genre so far. It's an interesting case of a genre starting on PC, being transitioned to mobile for a while, where it found various different forms of simplicity, and then making its way back to PC again in order to find its current form. And now we have a case where we have both traditional roguelites still being made, like Voidigo for instance, and new bullet heavens coming out simultaneously. So we have the older original version of the genre before it got filtered through mobile and turned into something else, and we have the newly transitioned form of that sort of iterated genre at the same time. And I think that kind of thing is kind of fascinating, honestly, because since I mentioned earlier that we very rarely see the development of a genre from the beginning like this in such a short period of time, I think it's really cool as someone that enjoys a lot of these genres to actually see how people's ideas change them over time, and how these different ideas can sort of become concrete, become sort of ingrained in the DNA of the genre, so that as it crosses platforms and gets iterated into various different forms, it sort of maintains a certain degree of that original design intention, and as it sort of shifts and twists and changes forms around that central idea, it can become something new while also still being recognizably related to something else, and have them both present at the same time in the genre. So what about Vampire Survivors? What's it like? Well, it's actually a very simple experience by design. All you have to do is move. Just WASD to move, that's it. Your attacks all auto-aim and auto-fire, depending on the specific weapon you use. And the base experience is a simple one, so you simply go around with your chosen weapon and kill enemies, which drop experience gems. You pick up the gems and eventually you level up. Every time you level up, you'll get a choice between several different things that you could pick one of, like, say, a new weapon, a new passive item, or an upgraded form of any of the weapons or passive items you currently have equipped. You have a limited number of slots for weapons and passive items that you can choose, and you eventually want to fill them out in a specific way because of the weapon evolution system, which we'll get onto in a second. So it starts off very easy with just you moving around whipping things or throwing across at things or just doing something very simple, but by like the 20-minute mark, you'll have just massive hordes of enemies assailing you from every direction. You'll be firing like 10 different varieties of projectile in a huge storm all over the screen, and it becomes very silly and enjoyable because of that. As time goes on, certain events occur, and the levels and events are not randomly generated, which is an important part of the game because you're meant to memorize what bosses spawn and what specific waves of enemies spawn at each threshold of time in every level. So, at 10 minutes into the forest level, a specific thing will happen, and it will always happen the same way at exactly 10 minutes. It's something that you can count on and remember. But while this base is a simple one, things get a lot more complex when the other mechanics of the game start to weave together. Like, for instance, the aforementioned weapon evolution system. The way that it works is every active weapon has a passive item that it is linked to. And if you have both the weapon at maximum level, which is level 8, and at least one level of that specific passive item, all you have to do is kill a boss and get a chest. Normally when you get a chest, it will level up some of the random equipment that you have. It'll just choose randomly at least one of them, sometimes up to 5 of them, to level up. But if you have one of them at max level and have its corresponding passive item, it will evolve that weapon into a completely new form that is drastically more powerful and has extra effects. For example, the whip will turn into a multi-hitting, much longer reach red whip that actually leeches health as it deals damage, which is super useful. powerful. The fireball staff will start to shoot meteors. The lightning ring will create like cluster chain lightning all over the screen. Things get just kind of ridiculous, and honestly, you're really meant to evolve your weapons as much as possible because you probably won't really survive past around the 20-minute mark in each level without at least some evolved weapons, because the massive increase in utility and DPS that the evolved forms bring becomes required as you get onto the later stages of each level, because you'll be facing so many high health enemies in such large waves that you need that extra damage in order to survive. And so every run becomes about working with what you have, just like in a traditional roguelite where you go to your first item room not knowing what you're going to get, and then you start to make your build based on what you get first. This is basically the same thing, except condensed into like a 30-minute experience. So you'll be grabbing various weapons and various passive items in order to synergize yourself as best as possible to become an overpowered wall of bullets as quick as you can to survive the later stages, all the way up to 30 minutes, which is the traditional time that these levels stop, although there are other game modes and things that go past that, because this game has a lot of layered mechanics as part of what makes it so interesting. Even though it starts off very simplistic, there's so much that weaves together to form the sort of fabric of this game. There's actually a ton of substance to it, despite on the surface looking very simplistic. It does have a roguelite style meta currency in the form of gold, where you can actually spend this gold on various permanent character upgrades outside of levels, where you will unlock things like, HP regeneration, better pickup range, higher base damage, all sorts of things like that, even a revival attempt. And as you explore the different maps, of course you'll have to unlock the maps first by surviving a certain amount of time in the previous map. Each map has its own unique tile set, its own unique hazards, and its own unique enemies, so you have to memorize all the various things that happen at each different time threshold over again for every new map, adding a lot of depth to the levels. And at the same time, there are various relics that you can pick up that are permanent upgrades in each of the maps. There are things like a grimoire that actually lets you know which weapons and which items synergize to create evolution, so that you can plan ahead a little bit. There's a deck of tarot cards, and you can actually unlock all of the individual arcana with all sorts of different unlock conditions, and then form a deck of up to 3 cards that you can take with you that provide various passive benefits and sometimes negatives as well, to either make things more challenging but more rewarding, or easier, or whatever sort of combination of things that you want. So these games tend to have this deceptive amount of mechanical complexity about them. They start off looking like something that's so easy and basic, but once you actually get into it, start unlocking things, start trying new characters, start finding new weapons, you discover that there's actually a lot here, and that these games are by no means as small as they seem at first. And there are tons and tons of things to unlock in this game, especially all the new characters. Many of the new characters come with their own unique new weapons that you can't get access to without playing them and surviving a certain amount of time with them first. So you have multiple layers of different unlocks that all slowly expand the variety and scale of the game from something simple to something much more involved. But I think there's something else to look at with this genre as well, and that's why are they so popular? What is it about this particular new concept that really speaks to people so much to make these games super popular? And I think this is sort of a multi-layered reason. One of the reasons is these games are almost always very cheap. These are super inexpensive. When Vampire Survivors first launched, it was $3. And after its massive amount of content updates in early access, now that it's at 1.0, actually past that at this point, it is $5. So it is not an expensive game at all, and that is a trend that almost every one of these games keeps. They are usually around the $3 to $5 mark, making them very easy bite-sized purchases. But I think another reason they're so popular is people like the experience of leveling up in an RPG. They like the experience of getting to become a powerful build of multi-layered abilities and weapons, but they like doing it in a really condensed form. An RPG that has these mechanics might take like 60 hours before you're near the end of it, and this game can do all of it in 30 minutes. There's also the famous just one more run effect, where these games have such a low barrier to entry that it's really easy to just say, okay, one more, just one more, because there's basically nothing you have to memorize. You don't need a wiki up, like say if you're playing something like Isaac or Gungeon, oftentimes you might need to look certain things up in the wiki because there's a lot of stuff that's not explained or stuff that's kind of obscure. These games tend to give you all of the numbers and all of the synergies and everything right up front. They basically tell you to your face everything that you need to know, so there's no feeling of I'm gonna have to need a bunch of information before starting to play this. It's just you jump in and there's basically nothing stopping you. It's very simple and very easy to do, and it's also a very bite-sized experience because the most time you can spend in a normal Vampire Survivors level is 30 minutes, so that you know just one more run because, hey, it's only going to take half an hour at most. I'm not going to lose like 4 hours of my afternoon to this game if I just want to do one more run. And I think it's really a layering of all of those reasons: the very low price, the one more run effect, the hidden mechanical complexity that tends to dawn on you slowly and not take a whole bunch of your time to fully reveal, and tends to get you into each match very quickly because there's very little barrier to entry. You just start at level 1 and all you have to do is move and sometimes aim, and that's it. But you will of course always end those missions as a super overpowered ball of death, or at least that's the hope. So these games are just very easy to dip into, very easy to just have, and I think that simplicity in just buying them for cheap, having them on your desktop, and occasionally hopping in for a run or two is exactly why they're so popular. There's such a slight barrier to entry, there's no prior knowledge, there's no wikiing, there's no memorizing stats. It's just a very simple experience that still remains complex enough to keep your attention once it gets going. So now that we've established what a bullet heaven actually is and where the genre came from, in the next couple of videos we're going to be looking at some of the other games that have come after Vampire Survivors and are taking this genre in their own directions. I'm going to be covering several games at once in each video and just taking a look at what they do differently, what helps them stand out, and what kinds of design decisions they're making that are different from Vampire Survivors and why. I'll go ahead and link the VS store page, the Steam page, down below in the description, just in case somehow you haven't heard of it or haven't bought it yet. If this is a genre for you, then hopefully these videos are interesting, and if it's not for you, maybe you at least find some interesting things in them. And of course, don't worry, they're not going to take over the other content that I'm making either. They're just some supplementary stuff that I thought would be fun to make. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.